Hi, good morning. If you're kind of in UK, European General Greenwich Mean time zone. Um, while we kind of wait for Chitra to join and for others to join, we're discussing Chitra's work and speaking with her as what she works on is extremely topical and ties in with the 16 days of activism to raise awareness and increase efforts to end violence against women and girls. Additionally, with the recent NSARS protests in Nigeria and the quick mobilization by various groups, from youths to mothers, but in particular LGBTI organizations, Chitra's expertise in the region with the LGBTI community further adds to the excitement of being able to speak with Chitra today. And she's just joined, so I'm going to invite her on. Hi, good morning.
Hi, good morning.
How are you today?
I'm fine, thank you. I think there's a bit of an issue with my internet connection.
Oh,
Um,
bless.
of course. So,
No, we'll persevere. We'll persevere. Thus far, it's good. I'm hearing you well, so hopefully everyone else can kind of tune in, but it's recorded, so any issues, they can catch it on catch up, so to speak.
okay, great.
Fantastic. So I'm just going to do a quick introduction of yourself before I kind of get into the questions. So again, everyone, I'm so happy to introduce Chitra Nagarajan. Chitra currently lives in Maiduguri, which is in northeast Nigeria. She is a journalist and a writer who writes on climate change, conflict, feminism, foreign policy, migration, and just kind of the Nigerian wider Lake Chad region, as well as race and sexual orientation and gender identity and gender expression. She's written for The Guardian, This is Africa, and has appeared on the BBC World Service. Her book, which you can see back there, is titled She Called Me Woman, Nigeria's Queer Women Speak, which is a book of narratives co-edited by Azeenarh Mohammed and Rafeeat Aliyu and was published by Cassava Republic Press. She is currently working on a book on the conflict in the Lake Chad Basin and is part of the editorial collective of Feminist Dissent. She had said her internet was no good, so she might have to pop back in. But I will finish the introduction of her quickly. She is based in Nigeria, as I had said. And the Feminist Dissent is an academic journal which focuses on gender and fundamentalism. And while we wait, her research areas over the past 15 years have taken her to China, Guinea, Liberia, Myanmar, Sierra Leone, and the United Kingdom, as well as the United States. And currently, she focuses on civilian protection, conflict mitigation, climate security, human rights, particularly those of women and girls, and peace building. She's also an activist involved in feminist, anti-racist, anti-fundamentalist, and queer movements and human rights. And my Human Rights Pulse and myself want to extend a really warm welcome and thank Chitra for taking the time to join us this morning with her, I think, very challenging, oh bless her, internet. And just as, I guess, a bit of housekeeping is that we'll potentially open the floor in the last 10 minutes for questions via messages. We'll just kind of have to hang out, I think, a couple of minutes while Chitra maybe repositions herself or reconnects before we can dive into the interview. But she's definitely someone who is highly experienced in her area. Hi.
Hi, I'm so sorry. My internet.
No. Okay, perfect. I'll be back.
Okay.
So I will just dive into the first question. I did do an intro, which I promise you was wonderful.
I think I caught
So
bits
I
of it.
Yeah, good. Thank you. So, to start off, for our listeners and followers who are unfamiliar with the human rights landscape of sexual orientation and gender identity on the African continent and in Nigeria, could you briefly give us a background and of the landscape in Nigeria and potentially any legislation that targets or criminalizes the LGBTI community?
Sure. Thank you very much for the question, and thank you for the invitation to join. So
Thank you.
Nigeria, as other British colonies, has the legislation really has its. Hi.
Just a little bit in and out. Okay, yeah, I can hear
Okay.
you now.
Okay, so I'm not sure how much you caught, but I was just saying that the antecedents of the legal landscape really dates back to the era of colonization. And as in other jurisdictions colonized by the British, um, you had a criminalization of anyone who had sex against the order of nature. This is a terminology that you find in many places. But since then, we've had a number of legislative developments. Most recently, the Same-Sex Marriage Prohibition Act, which was passed in 2014. Um, and that not only kind of reinforces the existing provisions that were there, but of affection, and also the registration and running of clubs, societies, and organizations that quote unquote promote homosexuality. So we saw a real kind of deepening, I guess, of anti years ago. And really around this time, we saw an increase in public discourse, a narrative against sexuality. I should also say that there's a real lack of understanding and conflation of issues of sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. So everything is kind of grouped as gay. And at the same time, a conflation of homosexuality and paedophilia, which, you know, as you can imagine, makes it quite difficult to do advocacy on this issue. However, saying that, in the last few years, we have seen some quite a marked change in public attitudes around homosexuality, and a number of people trying to influence the cultural sphere. So in addition to our book, we've had a number of other books, fiction and non-fiction.
Mhm.
Oh, hello. Hi.
Sorry, I don't know if you can hear or see me.
Okay, okay, I can hear you now.
What?
I'm on. Yeah, no, I can hear you now. Okay, perfect. I think a brief kind of follow up is because I think we are going to discuss a little bit maybe differences between northern regions and southern regions. If maybe it's worthwhile explaining why, when Nigeria's kind of research talked about and studied, it's maybe broken into the varying geographical areas.
Yes. So, Nigeria is a big country with lots of different ethnicities and cultures. Um, and their, realities vary quite significantly across the country according to geography, but also according to age and class in particular. So someone's wealth really determines how they're seen and how they're treated, and can be protection against discrimination. But in terms of the North versus the South, historically, you've had experiences of queerness all over the country, which has manifested in different ways. So, for example, in some of the communities, like the Igbo in the South, the Southeast, you had this practice of marriage between women, which, I mean, maybe is not the same-sex marriage that we know at the moment, but shows that there was some possibility for women to enter into a socially accepted union culturally. Whereas in the North, you had communities of young ladies who are people who are gender at birth, are are seen as feminized men, in that they take on certain roles and behaviors that are gendered female, and can enter into sexual relationships with women or men. And this group had certain status in Hausa society. So you can really see how so the legal regimes are different across. So many parts of northern Nigeria have with quite strict punishments against homosexual acts, and you've seen a number of cases prosecuted in the Sharia courts. I mean, I wouldn't say freedom in Abuja, the capital, and Lagos, the biggest city. But we see forms of religious fundamentalism and discrimination operating differently.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. And my next question then is about your book and what led yourself and your co-editors to bring together the stories and experiences in the book, She Called Me Woman. Hi, sorry
Hi,
about
I'm
no,
so sorry that my internet is so bad. This is
no.
the joys of internet in Nigeria.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. I'm very, very aware, definitely. So totally fine. I think, I'm not sure, I think you probably didn't hear my question, but it was about what led yourself and your co-editors to bring together the stories and experiences in your book, She Called Me Woman.
Um, so it was a conversation that the three of us had around late 2014. And as I mentioned before, the Same-Sex Marriage Prohibition Act was passed earlier that year. And there was a lot of conversation about queerness in Nigerian political and public discourse, completely always negative, and with very few, if any, queer people actually speaking. So we had seen similar projects being done in other countries, collections of narratives of queer women or queer people in general, and we wanted to do something similar, really to address the erasures that we saw was happening in the Nigerian public space, erasures of the histories of same-sex love and relationships in Nigeria, histories of fluidity of gender identities and gender roles, but also erasures of queer people from the public discourse, which was very dehumanizing, and both at the same time kind of hyper-visibilized queer people, but invisibilized them. So conversations about queerness were everywhere, but queer people themselves were missing from the discourse. And also we felt that a lot of people who were even talking, it wasn't just that queer people themselves were missing from the conversations, but anybody who was an ally, or anyone who had family or friends who, you know, were lesbian, gay, transsexual, transgender, etc. And we felt that there just needed to be something done, and something done that positively tried to explain people's realities. And that's really where the genesis from the book came from.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you so much. And could you explain how you all decided on the methodology taken to kind of record these snapshots of histories and experiences of queer women?
Yes, I mean, so we wanted definitely to be a medium where people could express their realities, their life histories and stories in their own words. And really, we were just the conduit for them to do so. So that's why we settled on writing a book of narratives. And the methodology that we used was in-depth interviews with as diverse a range of people as we were able to, and really kind of asking them about their lives and their experiences and their feelings about what was happening. We then went away and transcribed the interview, and then from that constructed a narrative, and then went back to our narrators and went through the narrative with them. So what I did was I met people again face to face, and I asked them to read the entire narrative all the way through themselves, just so they had a general sense of what it was, and then asked them for reflections and made changes based on their immediate reflections, but then also went through line by line or paragraph by paragraph, reading aloud, so that people were able to, I guess, have more time to reflect, and also kind of go in deeper into how they felt about their narrative. And of course, at any stage of the process, people were free to say that they no longer wanted to be involved. And we had narrators dropping out at each stage of the process. Because I mean, it's quite a brave thing to do, really.
It is,
I mean,
definitely,
yeah.
No, that's incredible. That's so cool. And my next then is, what is the value of these types of stories to the kind of wider consciousness and work being done by LGBTI activists in Nigeria, Africa, the global South, the big global South?
I think it's invaluable, really, both in the present day, but also in the future. So first of all, it allows people to tell their stories in a way that's positive and affirming and non-judgmental. It holds a mirror up to the queer community in Nigeria, a chance for people to see, I mean, not the same experiences, but similar experiences to their own, being described and being described and framed in a positive way. It also makes the point that queer people are Nigerian and they've been in Nigeria, you know, since ever, and really documents people's stories and people's histories. It's really interesting because actually when you read the book, a lot of people's experiences you can really see are quite similar to the experiences of many Nigerians, whether that's the difficulties of young people getting a job or being frustrated by corruption and nepotism, growing up in big extended families, and having, you know, real levels of family love and connection. We wanted to focus specifically on queer women's experiences because, at least at that time, this was completely erased from the discourse. So everything was talking about gay men. And even in the community, gay men were more represented in the people who led organizations and the movements. That's changed now, but this was, you know, 5-6 years ago when we started this project. And again, so many of the experiences that the narrators had were reflective of what it means to be a Nigerian woman, whether that's the friendship of other women, or the sexism, the sexual harassment, sexual violence that many women in Nigeria and other parts of the world experience. So we found it to be a really useful way of communicating people's realities and people's stories, and that queerness is just one aspect of what shapes their experiences and just one aspect of their identity. And it's been great actually, because we found that the book and reading the book has in some cases helped shape people's attitudes, has helped change people's attitudes. So there's this great story that I heard of somebody giving the book to her very homophobic neighbor, lending it to her to read, and then afterwards her neighbor saying, oh, you know, I didn't realize the things that queer people in Nigeria go through, and really having changed her mind as a result of reading the stories. But I think as well, we also didn't want to just influence kind of the present day in Nigeria, but also make sure that our book and the stories contained in it formed part of the archive of the future. So that unlike people say now, you know, this thing is not Nigerian, it's un-African. If people try saying that in 300, 200, 500 years time, you can say, well, that's not true, because, you know, hopefully they won't even try saying that, because there will have been so many queer stories infusing the cultural landscape in Nigeria and the rest of the continent and the rest of the world. That won't be possible. I mean, imagine if we had a book of narratives from even the 1940s in Nigeria, what difference that would make. And I mean, when you have the accepted wisdom or the accepted narrative being so, you know, this idea that this thing is Western, it's not of us, it's come here, it's poisoning us, it's, you know, this idea of contamination through contact with the West. It's really important to have something that says, like, kind of makes a distinction from that. And I think, you know, reading the book, no one can say that that narrative is correct. And yeah.
No, I think that's fantastic. And I do remember in my dissertation definitely making mention that part of why I see this as a seminal piece is the fact that I think one of the areas lacking that a lot of historians love to bag on about is like Africa as an oral history kind of tradition, and that with this lack of maybe a written history, I mean, there's the whole politics of the hierarchization of histories, but if we did have that kind of written history, then and well, there's just a little bit less that can be contested. So
Yes.
it's
Yeah.
definitely, I think, going to be an important book for the
Yeah.
essay.
And also I think like there's this idea of the West as this terrain of liberalism and acceptance and open-mindedness when it comes to sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. And countries in Africa and Asia being places of darkness and human rights violations and sadness and pain. And we know that neither of those characterizations are true, right? I mean, you just look at the conversations in, for example, the UK and the US around trans rights at the moment, and it's very clear that they're not a beacon of rights and liberty. But also, and this was something that we were very clear in our book to bring out, that queer people in Nigeria don't spend all their times having their human rights violated and being rejected by their families. And we wanted to purposefully bring out, I mean, of course that's there, but we wanted to bring out the stories of joy and acceptance and community and fellowship within the book to really present the totality of people's lives. And I think that's also important for queer people who read the book, especially queer young people, to know that it is possible to find love and joy and acceptance, and that there are families who accept you and friends who will invite you and their partner to their weddings, or colleagues who kind of know about your same-sex partner and are fine with it. I think that's also important for queer people, or people, especially people coming into understanding of their sexuality or gender identity, to know, but also for the future, for people to know that like even in the past, even in 2015, mere months after the Same-Sex Marriage Prohibition Act was passed, you still had people who were happy and getting on with their lives. And I think that's very important as well.
No, definitely. The book is definitely, I think, a wonderful just rainbow of different stories and of different experiences. And definitely, I do think it's a beautifully intertwined kind of journey of both, as you said, the kind of realities, but also the fact that there is kind of a joy and happiness in their communities, and they go out and they, it's not everyday oppression. Sometimes, sometimes they are happy. So I think I definitely would agree with that. Yeah.
And I was going to say, and I should mention that it's not just our book, like there are a number of things that we see in the cultural space trying to highlight queer stories, films, fiction, and it's really important, I think. And a lot of people are really working in the sites of cultural activism as being necessary to change attitudes and change narratives. And it's really a precursor to any legal or policy change that we will see in Nigeria.
No, I totally agree with that. I do. I really do. So then my next question is about the thing that no one can stop talking about, COVID-19.
We did a really good job going half an hour without talking
Yeah,
about it,
I think we did. It's almost like the new weather chats. Oh, COVID, thoughts, opinions. How do you feel that it's affected the activism and work being done around LGBTI issues in Nigeria? And then has it affected maybe the north and south of Nigeria in similar or diverse ways?
Yeah. So maybe I'll start by talking about how COVID-19 has affected queer people in Nigeria, and then go on to talk about queer activism. So, COVID-19, even though the numbers of official cases in Nigeria are not very high in comparison to the rest of the world, COVID-19 has had a very profound and negative impact on the country, on everything from access to healthcare. People are scared to go to health clinics at the moment, access to education, so schools were closed for many months, but also, people's livelihoods. And we saw there were restrictions in Nigeria for some time. It varied across the country. But also not just in terms of people not being able to leave their homes, but also bans on travel within states, bans on movement across borders. And of course, this is how a lot of people make their livelihoods. And this affected everybody in Nigeria. But it affected queer people in the same ways, but maybe to a greater extent, because queer people were less likely to have the support of their families and friends and wider social networks compared to non-LGBT people. Many of them, as a result of the economic impacts of COVID-19, were forced to move back in with families who didn't accept them or didn't even know about them, be worried about the fear, the risk of discovery, be exposed to lots of discriminatory comments, be forced to take part in religious activities, which were part of a faith that was very homophobic or transphobic. In some cases, people were taken because their homosexuality or their gender identity was discovered during the course of the pandemic, because people were spending more time together. Some people were taken to religious conversion therapy during this time. Access to medicines, particularly antiretrovirals for people with HIV, really suffered because people didn't want to be known as taking these medicines. And when they ran out, it was difficult for them to get to the health clinic to access more. There were many cases of people being thrown out of their homes by family members who discovered their sexual orientation or gender identity, having to move back in with abusive ex-partners because there was nowhere else to go, increased levels of homelessness, also intimate partner violence as well, increased, as it increased in opposite sex couples too. And in some cases, there were a few cases of corrective rape also discovered or reported, and these were by lesbian and bisexual women who suspect very strongly that it was their own families who arranged their rape, because they had discovered their sexuality and thought that this was the way to, save their daughter. So we really, and also I should mention, and this was something that we saw specifically in more in southern parts of Nigeria, an increase in police extortion and blackmail. So the police seem to have learned from COVID-19 public health measures and engaged in contact tracing, particularly of gay men. So when they would arrest people who had, or at least they alleged that they had broken the COVID-19 restrictions, if they had, any suspicion of their homosexuality, they would search them, they would go through their phones, and if they found, so-called incriminating evidence, WhatsApp chats, photos, messages to partners, they would blackmail the man in question and extort quite considerable sums of money from them, but also at the same time require them to give the names and contact details of all the gay men or queer people that they knew, and then go to those people's houses and pick them up and do the same for them. And this really became like a money-making scheme for the police during this time that particularly affected queer people.
Wow. I
So
guess,
yes.
that is a bleak landscape, to say the least. And I guess, how then do you think that it's affected kind of, I guess, the activism? I mean, I think is probably evident, but to flesh that out.
Yes, so I mean, in terms of activism, I mean, there aren't many LGBT organizations in Nigeria. And, even before the pandemic, people really were overstretched and struggling to cope, to meet needs, and also like across the spectrum of what is needed.
Yeah.
But the pandemic really it put organizations under so much pressure, and people struggled even to provide services to the level that they were providing them before, because restrictions meant that people were not able, during the time of restrictions, it meant that people were not able to leave their homes to provide assistance. They also had to think of new ways. So, for example, organizations providing health services to find ways of getting HIV medication, and usually people would come to the center to pick it up, but getting HIV medicine like across Lagos, for example, in a time where there are restrictions, where the people who transport, like drivers, have really increased their prices. And also, like, how do you get HIV medication to like these group of people who have been coming to the clinic? So I think just providing the same services that they were providing before was really challenging. And you have to remember that there was a lot of work that was needed to adapt, how an organization functions in a time where everybody comes together in the office versus when everybody's working from home in a country where there isn't good internet, as we know from this morning. And people don't have, like their homes set up as workspaces. Also, the mental health impacts of the pandemic affect everyone, including people who work in LGBT organizing. And then at the same time, so you're struggling to provide services as you were before, but then there are new needs as well. So I mentioned before, a real sharp increase in levels of intimate partner violence, levels of family violence increasing as well, people being made homeless, these cases of corrective rape that I mentioned, the mental health impacts of the pandemic on LGBT people. And so you're really struggling to try and not just keep going, but provide new types of services and adapt to the changing contours of people's needs. And that's really, really hard. And I think like all, human rights organizations, so if you talk to feminist organizations and women's rights organizations, they also struggled as well. And it was, it still is a very difficult time.
To be organizing, I can imagine. So it's almost, as we see it even in the quote unquote global north and in the UK, organizations that I support are definitely struggling to kind of keep that sustained pressure on, so to speak, that comes through organizing work. I guess then pivoting a bit, but I think quite related to something you'd mentioned earlier, which is what is the importance of, I think, the LGBTI presence and support in the recent EndSARS protests that occurred in Lagos and cities around the country in October 2020?
Yes. So EndSARS was or is a movement against police extortion and police brutality. And I mentioned before how that has affected members of the queer community in Nigeria. I think police extortion and brutality is an issue that affects all Nigerians apart from the very wealthy and elite. And it's one issue that can bring people together across, ethnicity, religion, class to a large extent, and other aspects as well. And we did see a number of people, LGBTI people, not just attending and being part of the EndSARS protests, but also doing so in a way that made it very clear, made their sexual orientation or gender identity very clear, which was fantastic because this was really one of the first times we've seen that in Nigeria. People marching, holding up a banner saying, I'm a lesbian and this affects me too, which was quite incredible. I mean, the response to it was mixed, I would say. So there were some people who, you know, like a very anti-queer people, and so there was some like verbal abuse and in some cases physical violence against those people. Other people saying things like, you know, like I I'm all for the gay people and I believe in their rights, but now is not the time. Like, you know, this is a protest against the police. Like, don't make it about LGBT people. And not really understanding the links. So there was a lot of public education that went on in that time, especially in social media spaces, trying to educate people about the ways that the police also prey on queer people and prey on them specifically, and also that people are more vulnerable to police extortion and blackmail and harassment as a result of I guess kind of the discriminatory nature of the Nigerian public space. Yes, so it'll be interesting to see how that goes moving forwards and what impact that has. I really hope that as a result of the NSARS protest, there are alliances formed between different movements in ways that we haven't seen before. But yeah, let's wait and see.
Yeah, that would be incredible. No, that's definitely incredible. And then I think kind of one maybe last question on maybe the topic and issue of just queerness in Nigeria is the effects of COVID-19, the role that it played in enabling an anti-elite sentiment to rise and kind of the catalyzing demands for change that we saw in the NSARS protests.
Yes, so it's interesting because the NSARS protest, I mean, brought together people, as I said, of all different walks of life and all different generations, but it was mostly young people who were part of the NSARS protests, and it was, you know, mostly young people who were part of it, and then mostly young people who led it. And really, this is a generation who have received very little from the state, as opposed to their parents and grandparents who, you know, were born and came of age at a time where the Nigerian education system was better, the health system was better. It was possible to get established in life and find a job and get good livelihoods. That's really changed over the past 20 years or so. And so, you know, the education system has deteriorated, the health system has deteriorated, the electricity situation has deteriorated, the roads, insecurity. And really, it was just anger at the reality that not only does the state not provide anything for you, but it's like actively going out and oppressing you, and it's preventing you from being able to provide for yourselves, because if you do manage to make some money, you have to pay that, or you have to give that over because it's extorted by the police. And you know, and I also don't want to exceptionalize Nigeria vis-a-vis the behavior of the police, because we have seen the police being problematic in many parts all over the world.
Hi, Azeenarh.
Hi. Yes. Hi, Azeenarh. I see Azeenarh, one of the co-editors of She Called Me Woman, just joined the conversation. Yes. Yes, so I would just say that really. And I think during COVID-19, especially when we saw a number of government mandated restrictions further, you know, affecting people's livelihoods. And then kind of specific examples of police brutality. People just were really frustrated and had enough.
Yeah, no, definitely. And as I definitely agree with you that let us not exceptionalize Nigeria, plus the new kind of anecdotal knowledge that actually the British kind of empire was critical in kind of training and developing
Yes.
what we know as the special anti-robbery, blah, 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 blah. So
Yes,
definitely I
and
do
also
agree. Yeah.
if you look at the relationship between the states and the people,
Mm,
there's a lot of remnants of colonization left in it. You know, it
yeah.
was
Yeah.
the British colonizers who put forward a particular way of policing, and a particular way
Yeah.
that the state interacts with its citizens, the politicization of systems of community leadership,
Yeah.
the so-called traditional leaders,
Yeah.
which really has broken whatever pre-existing social contract there was. Um, Now, you know, it has been decades after the end of colonization, so not everything is the fault of colonization, but we need to recognize the way that that experience of empire and colonization still persists into the
Yeah.
present day.
Definitely. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I think pivoting a bit now to more of your recent work and publications on the effect of COVID-19 on violence kind of against women and girls, since we are amidst the 16 days of activism to bring awareness to these issues surrounding violence against women globally,
Yes.
I wanted to ask if the trends that have arisen in your research around the effect of COVID-19 on violence around against vulnerable groups in Nigeria echoes the trends emerging globally, or do you think they differ geographically with regard to Nigeria?
Yeah, I mean, let me start by saying that even before the pandemic, levels of violence against women and girls were very high in Nigeria, as in other parts of the world. Um, and we have seen it's difficult to get a completely accurate picture just because of lack of you know, proper data collection and
Yeah.
collation and analysis. But I spoke to feminist and women's rights activists and people who provide services to survivors of violence against women and girls across the country.
Mm,
And everywhere we had seen an increase in levels of gender-based violence, in terms of intimate partner violence, because
mm,
people were spending more time at home. Some of the known drivers of intimate partner violence, such as you know, times of economic uncertainty, times of great mental stress. Um, these were exacerbated during the pandemic. Um, at the same time, cases of rape and sexual violence also increased. Um, Both those committed by family members. So there were a number of cases of incest, of fathers raping their daughters reported. Um, so family members and neighbors, but also kind of cases where strangers engaged in sexual violence as well.
yeah.
Um, which was interesting because you some people may think that this may reduce as people are mixing less during a time of restrictions, but you have to remember that even though people were restricted from moving, people still moved around their communities, and there were cases of people breaking into homes to rape the women and girls who were living there as well. In addition to these forms of violence, we have some indications of levels of female genital mutilation and
Mm,
cutting going up, increase in early and forced marriage
yeah.
um, as well. So yeah, so we saw a real increase in levels of gender-based violence across the country. We also saw a real increase in levels of awareness of
Okay.
violence against women and girls during this time,
Yeah.
because so many cases were being reported.
Yeah.
And I think it was a mix of, in some cases, really horrifying statistics being
Mm,
reported, but at the same time, particular cases reported which horrified the nation. So, you know, a young girl who would go to church to study, being raped and murdered in church,
mm,
finding that a middle-aged man was using sweets to lure young
mm,
girls as young as 9 years old, to sexually violate them. So yes, as a result of that, there was a real public outcry. And feminist and women's rights activists were at the forefront of that and calling for the declaration of a state of emergency on gender-based violence, which was made by the Nigerian Governors Forum. Now, what that's led to since is a bit more uncertain, and I would say that as of now, we haven't seen really as much action being taken around gender-based violence. Some of it has tended to be performative. So the declaration of a state of emergency, talks about putting in place chemical castration for perpetrators of sexual violence, which of course is a human rights, there's a whole other conversation about that. I would say that's a human rights violation in and of itself. And actually, where is the evidence to show that harsher punishments lead to a deterrent effect? And actually where we have seen punishments increase in severity, that's led to a decrease in reporting. And more survivors dropping cases because they're under such intense pressure from the perpetrator and the family of the perpetrator to drop the case. So anyway, and very, very little work being done in the arena of prevention. And, as Azeenarh says, the government seems to think that the only way to resolve issues is through the use of violence. And yet there is so much global evidence to show that there are other ways to prevent violence against women and girls. And yet those tactics and strategies are not being put in place in Nigeria.
No, and I definitely agree. As it's kind of, as the saying goes, violence only begets violence. I just have 5 minutes, so I'm going to ask you one more question before I kind of let you do a bit of a wrap up, because I just have to ask it for myself, which is, how do you kind of see gender norms or are gender norms changing as a result of the effects of COVID-19 within various communities, or especially the communities that you work within in kind of the Northeast?
I mean, maybe I can talk specifically about Northeast Nigeria because that's
definitely,
that's where I know the best.
Feel free.
I would say gender norms were changing in Northeast Nigeria even before the pandemic, influenced by a decade of violence, and actually even before the conflict started in Northeast Nigeria, gender norms were changing because of the influence of globalization, more women earning livelihoods, being forced to earn livelihoods, the influence of consumerism, and other things as well. So from the 1980s, I mean, for a start, gender norms are never static, right? They're always changing. And then what we saw was, due to the violent conflict, we saw a real shift in gender norms because many of the men were no longer around. They had either been detained by the military, they had been killed, they were somewhere else trying to earn a livelihood. And even the men who were around were not able to provide for their families financially in the way that they had been before. And we've seen kind of women really being forced to take on decision-making power in a way that they were blocked from doing so before. And so women kind of financially providing for households. I mean, they all, many women did this even before, but we saw increased numbers of women doing that. And real kind of changes in gender norms. Well, I would say gender realities. The ways what women and men did changed as a result of the conflict. The norms are still there. So there's still this idea that a good man is the breadwinner of the household, provides security for his family and for the community. Of course, men are not able to meet those norms anymore, which causes them great psychological distress, but also can manifest in, for example, like trying to control the actions of their wives more than they were before, and also manifest in physical violence. And then you had COVID-19, which has further affected livelihoods, and you've seen gender realities changing even more as a result. And a lot of women talk about just, how incredibly busy they are now, because in addition to performing all their traditional gender roles, of looking after the family and the children, which, by the way, that has increased because the children are no longer going to school, and people are staying at home, so they're having to cook more often and look after the children. In addition to that, they're really having to hustle to find ways to earn money or access humanitarian distribution. I mean, they were doing that anyway, but it's become even more so. And at the same time, they're being told that everybody needs to wash their hands and maintain good personal hygiene. And so, they're spending hours in queues at water points to try and get the water for the homes to be able to maintain that level of personal hygiene that they're told that they're needing. And so the burdens on women have really increased. And at the same time, men who were engaged in livelihoods are less able to do so, or those livelihoods have been affected. So it's also affected men's sense of themselves and their sense of masculinity and not being able to live up to these very, the straitjacket of what it means to be a man.
No, definitely, that's great. And I guess you have like 2 minutes, but do you have any sort of concluding? I have 10 million questions that I could sit here for hours with you, but any sort of concluding remarks, any recommendations to kind of peace-building efforts, humanitarian assistance and aid, and the kind of general continual work to eliminate violence against women and girls, and of course the strides in LGBTI activism. How can we maybe continue the positive trends we were maybe seeing, or overcome the challenges that have arisen or been exacerbated by the effects of COVID-19? Kind of what is the way forward over the coming months and years? And then as a little side, if you want to chat or throw it in your answer, if a vaccination is kind of when it is done, and do you think it'll be well received and efficiently disseminated?
I mean, maybe I can talk about that. I mean, of course, we're all happy and excited that vaccines have been developed and hopefully will start, being rolled out soon. But let's be honest about the countries in which they're going to be rolled out in first. And it's not going to be Nigeria. And I think it'll be a long time before the vaccine comes to Nigeria. And also, other countries on the African continent. At the same time, I would say, because COVID-19 has not had, like, the disease itself has not had that big an impact in Nigeria. And, there's a whole nother conversation that we could have had around why that's the case. A lot of people doubt that COVID-19, not that they doubt that COVID-19, as a phenomenon is real in and of itself, but they doubt that it's present in Nigeria, and it's something that affects them. There are all of these narratives going around that, like, this is something that is affecting the people in the West, that it doesn't affect Africans because of the heat or because we have stronger constitutions or whatever else, and that and again, this exposes the level of mistrust in government, that this is something that the government is maximizing in order to make money, for individuals to divert money into their own personal pockets. And so, and you can see it, like the levels of adherence to public health safety measures are really low in Nigeria. Hardly anybody wears masks. In some places there is hand sanitizers at the entrance, but people don't really use it because they don't feel that COVID-19 is a real threat in Nigeria. And to some extent, there's some truth in that as well. So what all this means for the prospect of a vaccine and vaccine take-up in Nigeria, I don't know. I mean, it's been a long history of people, I guess, pushing back against vaccinations, even for things such as polio. So we had polio workers killed a few years ago in Nigeria because there were narratives that they were set to sterilize populations and reduce population growth. And again, I understand where that comes from because there is a history of that happening on the African continent, and black bodies in particular being forcibly sterilized against people's knowledge. Yes, so I just think that I'm not sure where we will be with the vaccine in Nigeria. There may be some take up amongst people who travel and are part of the educated elite, but beyond that, I'm not sure.
Sorry.
The electricity went out, so.
Oh, okay. Oh, bless you. Nigeria, everyone, which means she's not going to have Wi-Fi, which means I can't, I guess, thank her formally unless maybe her 3G kicks in. But thank you so much to everyone for joining us. I don't know if... Oh, perfect. Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, so I was telling everyone that thank you so much for joining us. I'm not sure how much you can hear me. I mean, we made it through the interview though. Woohoo. Are you back? All right, we may have to conclude because I don't know if it will come back before. Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you so much. Honestly, it's a pleasure to speak to you again. You always are so insightful. You're incredibly knowledgeable. You definitely are a human rights defender through and through, and that's just so appreciated. Just thank you so much. Lots of thank yous for you in the comments, and thank you for taking the time to join us today. And definitely everyone go follow her work, follow her on Twitter, get the book, She Called Me Woman. It is literally probably one of the best pieces that you will read, because Our Republic generally puts out wonderful African authorship, and I think that's always important. And so, yeah, thank you again so much for everyone who tuned in. Thank you, Chitra. And just so appreciated. And I've had such a wonderful morning.
Thank you very much.
You.
It was a real pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much
Great.
again. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.